Welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, and joining me as always is Shayne Kubas. We are joined by special guest today, Andrew Falce, contributor for Still Curtain. We got a lot on the agenda for today. We're going to go through all of the Steelers' potential cuts, and we'll see if we have any differing opinions here. We're going to talk a little Matt Canada. Let's first hit some trending topics here over this past week, and I want to start with Tremaine Edmunds. And Tremaine Edmunds to the Steelers talk. This is a topic I feel like it's been going on for a couple weeks now. I wrote about it personally a couple times already. Is it real? Is it justified? Can this actually happen? I know this would be a bigger free agent move than what we're used to seeing the Steelers do, but we know how they love those family bloodlines. So what do you think, Shayne?
I think it makes sense just because we've been really just lacking at linebacker for several years now, really since Bush kind of fell off last year and was injured the year before. We just haven't had that guy that can kind of do it all, at least athletically speaking. Edmunds has had his issues in coverage and instinctively, but in general, he's still a huge upgrade over what we've gotten over the past few years. I think it just comes down to the price, right? I mean, if he's going to be $12, $13, $14 million a year, I just don't know if that's a great investment to make with that amount of money, considering what else we need. And also, I just don't think Steelers are willing to pay that much for somebody. If it's like 10 million or less, I think you could start to see that become possible. And I think it would come down to if he wants to play for us badly enough, because he's probably going to get offers more than that 10, 11-ish million dollars a year. So it's kind of hard to say whether we should or not. It's really just based on, like I said, the price that you might have to pay for him.
I totally get the hype behind it because everyone wants that solid middle linebacker play that we really haven't had. I would even argue not even with Devin Bush, but since Ryan Shazier went down with injury. And Edmunds would, on paper, fill that void. You know, he's a freak athlete. Just the dude's gigantic, 6'5", 250, 260 pounds, and he flies around the field. But people were always like, oh, it's the brother thing. We're going to have more brothers. Well, Terrell Edmunds isn't signed next year yet. He's, as of now, going to enter free agency. And, yeah, granted, he came back this past season, but I would say overall he had a pretty solid season. I would expect to see his market be a little bit hotter than before. So there's no guarantee he's going to be here, let alone his brother. Then on top of it, too, I mean, you're kind of seeing off-ball linebacker a little bit more devalued as opposed to some other positions. And this team really needs to get some work in the trenches done. I'd love to see an upgrade at linebacker. They need an upgrade at linebacker. I'm just not sure if you can justify spending all that money on another free agent, just like they did with Miles Jack, Mark Barron. You know, the names just keep on going. The investment they made in Devin Bush. I'm just not sure Edmunds is going to fit the bill. And again, people that are like, well, it's a brother thing. There's no guarantee that Terrell's going to be here, let alone Tremaine. So.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a good point. And I think we have to look at it from kind of a couple different ways. First of all, I know that Mike Tomlin liked Tremaine Edmunds coming in. I don't think that was a surprise to anybody. Steelers needed a linebacker back then, young guy, super freak athlete from Virginia Tech. And so everything, the stars were lining that way. We knew that the Steelers weren't going to be in a position to draft him. They took his brother. And so one that was not quite as on the radar for us. And we were thinking maybe Jesse Bates, something like that. And so there was definitely interest there to begin with. The thing is, would the Steelers go against trend? Because I think that if the Steelers signed a player like Tremaine Edmunds, he instantly becomes the highest paid free agent in Steelers history. Like if I recall right, I think it's Steven Nelson right now in terms of money per year, free agent money per year. And so they just don't spend high in free agency at all. So this would go against what they do. At the same time, we're looking at Omar Khan running the show now and with Andy Weidel by his side instead of just Kevin Colbert. And so maybe they've got a different order of doing business. And so it'll be interesting. Linebacker is definitely a huge position of need. I don't think anybody will question that at all. It's just how much should a team be willing to pay for a linebacker? And I think Edmunds had a really good season. I wasn't impressed with him at all in the Cincinnati game in the playoffs. I thought he really struggled at times in that game, and he can be a little bit high variance. But I think he had a good season overall, was one of the better coverage linebackers in the NFL this year. Would certainly help that defense out, no doubt, from what they have right now. Just comes down to money right there. But I do think that the stories are kind of justified, at least from what we've seen. I mean, outside of the money, if we're just looking at Tomlin likes his guys, he scouted him, and he does value the bloodlines. And so if Terrell Edmunds comes back, and he can add one to the mix, and the guy that fits a position of need, I can see it happening. Let's talk about Brian Flores for a minute here. Had the interview with the Arizona Cardinals just this week for a head coaching position. And it's probably not going to be his last interview. I'm not sure what his chances are of getting this. The last I saw, he was second only to Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn in terms of odds to land this job. So what do you think is going to happen with Flores?
I do think ultimately he's going to leave. It's just, is it going to be a head coaching position? Is someone going to offer him a DC position? I think he definitely, I think a DC position is where he should go next, just because I feel like that gives him a better opportunity to show what he can do. Again, because with us, just being a linebacker coach, there's only so much you can really look at as far as how much impact he had, how much say he had, and how the defense worked and everything like that. I think it'd be a good fit for him to find a role as a DC where he has players that he thinks he can work really well in his scheme, develop that reputation again, and then try to get back into maybe a different head coaching spot. Just because the Cardinals are definitely a bit of a mess right now, and I have a hard time thinking that he's the kind of coach that will be able to make a quick turnaround, especially with Kyler Murray out for part of next year with his ACL injury. Like, there's just a lot of negatives for that job, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's the best position for him to take right off of, coming to the Steelers for the year. So I would understand if he takes it because it's a head coaching job. It's hard to pass up, but I think he should be looking for a better opportunity maybe next off season after finding a different role as a DC for someone else this year.
I've kind of kept it under the idea that, and I don't have great reasoning behind it, but he's either going to leave as a head coach or he's going to be retained as that linebacker, defensive assistant, kind of just that. Because I think he really appreciates Pittsburgh coming around and giving him that job last year when obviously everything fell out with Miami. I think he looks at it and realizes, okay, even though I don't have the role, I still have a huge impact on this defense. I'm still, working alongside Terrell Austin and working hand in hand with this defense. If he gets that head coaching job offer, that's obviously a lot harder to turn down. But I feel like for him, if he's around next year, it's because he didn't get a head coach job. I just don't see him taking a defensive coordinator spot unless, it's just too good of a gig to pass up. But other than that, I think it's head coach or bust. I think either he's coaching somewhere up at the top or he sticks with us for another year.
Yeah, and I think he's going to get that opportunity again at some point. And I don't think there's any reason for him to rush it. He's a young guy still, had success in Miami, and people know that. And that's why he's getting the interviews that he's getting right now. And so I'm not sure. It's hard to tell which way he's going to go. I can see him kind of maybe moving up the ladder, if you will, and taking the DC job first and then going to. But I think it would have to be the right situation. And I kind of agree with you, Shayne. I'm not sure if Arizona is the right situation right now. That team is kind of a mess. Kyler, even before the injury, was struggling. And so they got to get new guys in there. They need a new staff. And I just think that it's not an ideal situation to go over and try to take over that franchise from the state that they're in right now. I do think that Flores is going to leave. And so let's go around one more time, guys. And if I ask you yes or no, do you think that Flores is leaving this year?
I think the answer is yes, ultimately. Whether it's him taking a chance on a head coaching job if he gets an offer or as a DC. I will say one place I would be very interested in seeing him if the cards fall the right way, if a head coach comes in and wants to build out a staff. DC job with the Panthers, really good young defense, a lot of good players on that defense. Really could be a really good stepping stone type of job if that opens up for him. But I do think if he gets a head coaching job, it seems like he's the kind of guy like he'll take a head coach job if he can get it, even if maybe I wouldn't do it in his situation. And I think if it's Arizona, you just have to get assurances of like, hey, you guys have to understand where you're at as a team right now. We're not going to probably be good next year. So I want like some sort of security of like, I'm at least going to get a full offseason next year as well to kind of build out the team and see what we can do with Kyler and stuff like that. So if he gets that assurance, maybe he'll take that job, I would say.
I think I'll be opposite. I'll say I think he ends up staying. And like I said before, I think if he does get a really good head coaching opportunity, he'll take it. But again, he came to Pittsburgh after a pretty bad end to his stay in Miami. Despite him turning that team around, them starting to find some success with him, they obviously cut bait, which turned into the huge deal that it was last offseason. Yeah. I think he's going to be here and he's going to wait for that perfect opportunity. And unless he gets that, I don't see him leaving.
Yeah, that one is, it's a difficult to call. I'm going to say that he does leave, and it's because there are defensive coordinator positions open right now. And we know that there are a couple really strong defensive-minded coaching candidates out there in D'Amico Ryans and Dan Quinn. And so let's say one of those guys gets a head coaching job, maybe both of them, and maybe one gets another defensive coordinator job. I think Brian Flores is one of the next guys in line there that people are really going to be going after. And so I'll say that he is gone this season. It's worth noting that if Flores were to stay in Pittsburgh another year and then get hired away as a head coach, the Steelers would actually be awarded 2 third-round picks, one for that season and one for the following season, because of the new minority coaching rule. And so that would be interesting if it were to happen next year. It could give Steelers put a little draft capital into their pocket. Something worth considering. I don't even know if we're going to have to worry about that, because I think that he is kind of sought after, and we'll see if something happens with him this year. All right, let's talk about the Steelers' latest mock draft by Mel Kiper Jr. And to the surprise of nobody, he has Joey Porter Jr., the son of Joey Porter, former all-pro outside linebacker for the Steelers, going to Pittsburgh with the 17th overall pick. This is not much of a stretch to me, but I want to hear what you guys have to say. What would you think if this were the pick for the Steelers?
So I haven't gone into like a deep dive in draft prospects yet. I'm going to be starting to do that, since that's going to become more of a focus of what we do here, obviously, now that we're not involved in any games. But this is obviously a really nice early pick to make, because everyone kind of expects it, right? Like, everything about Mike Tomlin tells you, like, this is the guy that would make sense for him. We need corner. Obviously, we need a true outside corner that can play. Need to retain, Cam Sutton as well, but that's a whole other conversation. But getting a guy like him, long, athletic corner, can play man coverage, had an excellent season for Penn State. I think if he tests well, especially, he might not even be in this range for the Steelers, because there's a lot of conversation about who number one corner in this class is. I've heard a lot of Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon. I've seen Devin Witherspoon out of Illinois, who I also like a lot. Like, there's a lot of guys who are in that contention for, like, who's going to be the first guy off the board, and then that might determine where the rest of the guys fall. So 17th probably still feels like a good spot for him, like in that range as far as where he stands among prospects. But it's really easy to say this, right? Like, if you're, it's a very easy, like, yeah, I'm just going to put that in for now. If things change, they change. But this is a good way to kick things off because of what his name is and what the Steelers need. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, like Edmonds before, I mean, there's just that obvious tie there of his dad having played here, his dad having coached here on top of it. And again, similar to Shayne, I haven't really completely dove into the scouting process yet. I kind of scratched the surface with a lot of different prospects. I'm starting to do a deeper dive on to ones that I'm more interested in. With Porter, though, what I came away with when I first just glanced over his basic stats, seeing some of his basic film that I found on YouTube, I just kind of got a raw taste in my mouth about it. Like, he seems like he's a player that's going to have all those traits that you want in a cornerback, but I don't know if he's ready yet to be a top guy in the league. I think he might need a little bit of seasoning, especially in his rookie year. I think you're going to see him take some lumps in his rookie year because of it. That said, if the Steelers were to be able to get some of their own back in the cornerback room, if Sutton's locked up, Levi Wallace sticks around for another season, James Pierre's hanging around. It's not like he's a guy that would have to come out onto the field, right away. It's someone that could be worked onto the field. He's not my top cornerback as of now. And again, this is saying it with very little true of a deep dive yet into the room. He's not my top guy. I like Witherspoon more out of Illinois. I like Cam Smith out of South Carolina a lot. I would be okay with the pick. It's not my top choice, though, just because I think he's going to need some more time. And frankly, I'm more focused on the trenches, either offensive line or defensive line, with that first pick, assuming the right player fell there.
Yeah, it's going to come down to preference for a lot of teams, too. I think you got different styles of cornerbacks that are going to be going mid to late first round. I think Porter is one of those long boundary cornerbacks. There's the physical guy like Devin Witherspoon, the guy that Tomlin, I'm sure, is going to love as well. And then you got like Keely Ringo. And so there's definitely different options. They offer a little bit of different things there. I don't think that Porter offers you much in terms of taking the ball away. Just had one pick in 4 seasons in college. It's not to say that he can't do it, but I did notice he struggled a little bit with ball skills when he has the opportunity to pick the ball off. Little Ike Taylor-ish in that regard, where he'll drop some easy picks. It is interesting to note, though, one report came out that said that Joey Porter has 35-inch arms. And that's like offensive tackle size. That gives you a huge, huge advantage at the cornerback position. So if you test decent and you've got that long of arms to disrupt the passing lanes, that's something interesting there. I'm not a fan of taking cornerbacks early. And it's not just because the Steelers' track record. I think the hit rate on them is very low. And I think that if you look at the situation given right now, we just can't afford to ignore the trenches for the 100th year in a row, because it's where the Steelers kind of need to start laying their assets on the line there. And so it'll be interesting. Like he would be a guy like right now from the scouting that I've done. I've watched several games on Porter and some of the other cornerbacks as well, because there are a group of 4 or 5 guys that I really like. I might play it like which guy falls to me with the 32nd overall selection, the 33rd pick technically. I'd prefer to get them there rather than with that 17th pick. And I know that the Steelers' track record has not been great when it comes to drafting the cornerback position. It's also a pretty small sample size. So it'll be interesting. I think there is a lot of truth to this. This feels kind of like Najee Harris the other year to me, where it's like, this name is
don't get me started, Tommy. Don't get me started.
I know you and I both, man. And it's not a wise decision to take running backs in the first round. I think that most people would agree with that now, even with the turnaround that we saw with Najee. But it feels like that type of pick where it's like, this is a name that's going to follow the Steelers up until the time that they are on the clock in round 1, because it's Joey Porter Jr. He fits a position of need. He's from a local school that the Steelers always scout. And so there are a lot of stars that align there. And so we'll see what happens. Obviously, lots of different options are going to be available at that spot. And it's very early in the process still. All right, we're going to shift gears here, and we're going to talk about a really sensitive topic right now, and that is Matt Canada is returning to the Steelers to be the offensive coordinator for the 2023 season. I kind of have a feeling what you guys are going to say about this already, but we'll go ahead and open it up to you, Shayne.
Yeah, we've talked ad nauseum about Matt Canada throughout the year, both during the season and since it ended. And I think the problem with this ultimately is we all assume that the reason why he didn't lose his job is because we did technically get better in the back half of the year. The problem with that, and I think everyone who understands the sport well enough knows this, there's really 2 factors for that. One, his players just executed a little bit better. The running backs were healthier, especially Najee. And really, we just didn't play very many good teams. There just wasn't a lot of great defenses on the schedule down the stretch, not a lot of great teams. We didn't have the same pressure being put on the defense and the offense because we were playing really good teams in the first half of the year. So naturally, there is going to be a little bit of progression just because of that. So to me, even if you look at what we did in the back half of the year, though, offensively, it still wasn't good. So even though he got better, going from the worst to okay is not a jump that I want to see get somebody another year on their contract or keep their job. That doesn't mean anything to me. And I think most fans will say that getting better is not always the end all be all of it, because you have to either get way better in case of him, or there has to be tangible evidence to think that he's going to change what he's been doing wrong this whole time, whether it's his play sequencing, whether it's his addiction to trying to get 3rd and 4 every single drive, every single play. Like, it's just, there's so many things he does that I don't think is going to work out no matter who you put on the team with him, that keeping him another year feels like it's just delaying the inevitable and giving him another year just to sit there and see if he can magically figure it out. And I don't expect that to happen, frankly.
I'll dig into my bag of conspiracies. I think it's less that this team was winning down the stretch, but more with the fact that, and the report came out that his contract runs through another year, and this team has a very strong history of not firing coaches.
Yes. Yep.
Coaches will retire. Coaches will not have their contract renewed, but there is a very strong correlation of a coach comes in and he's not going to be fired. Now, obviously, we've seen coaches let go various different ways, like I said, with their contract just not being renewed, with their contract, or with them stepping down or retiring, like Dick LeBeau did, and then he turned around and went over to Tennessee and worked with them for a couple seasons.
Yeah.
I think a big reason why is that they don't want to have to sit there and, we fired Matt Canada. And if that is the case, that's a horrible reason to bring him on. I will say, and the one actual reasoning you can put with why should we keep Matt Canada is for the sake of consistency. There's a really strong track record of quarterbacks going through multiple different offensive coordinators in the early portion of their career, and that just ruins them because every year they're learning a new playbook. They can't focus on improving where they need to improve. That being said, the sake of consistency, consistency with Canada seems like it's going to be a pretty mediocre option. So I still don't think it's the right move. He just showed this season. I was willing to give him a pass with Roethlisberger in his last season.
Me too.
Obviously there was, that issue of, okay, I got this old immobile quarterback that, I can't really function my offense how I have it, drawn up. well, he got his guy. I mean, Trubisky and Pickett obviously both can move around in the pocket, take off if they need to. And we saw the same, if not worse, of an offensive performance the entire season. And I get it that by the end of the year, they were winning games. They were putting up some more points per game, but a lot of the issues that they had earlier in the season, it wasn't like they were magically fixed and improved upon by the end of the year. You still had a lot of the same issues with the offense where the passing game, especially the middle and deep passing game over the middle of the field, were still just abysmal. The running game got better, slightly more efficient, but I would also argue that the offensive line started to gel more, especially in the second half of the season. And then, like you said, Shayne, the defenses we played in the second half of the year, nothing compared to the defenses we played in the first half, or even the offenses. This offense could do more ground control because they didn't have to worry about catching up to the multi-score deficits they had against Philadelphia and against Buffalo. They could instead focus on, okay, let's establish the ground game, run Najee, run Jalen, and, when we have to pass, we will.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if that schedule was flipped on its head and the Steelers start with the easy games and they finish with the hard games, does Canada have a job going into 2023? And maybe the answer is yes. Anyway, we know that Steelers have been loyal to a fault when it comes to their coaching staff, front office, players in the past. And so it could be a situation where they're just trying to let him play out his contract. I think that Kenny Pickett being a rookie this past year comes into play as well. And so they want that continuity. Obviously, those two have a connection in the past from their time at Pitt. And so I think that there's a number of factors, obviously, that go into this. I'm not a fan of bringing Matt Canada back this year. I don't believe it was the right choice. And for those reasons that you guys already stated, he averaged just over 20 points a game in the second half of the season when you played teams like the Panthers, the Falcons, the Raiders, the Ravens without Lamar Jackson. And so the sample just isn't good enough yet, where there's not enough firepower. And personally, I think this comes from the top. I think this comes from Mike Tomlin down as well, because to me, this is a philosophy issue. You are trying to get away with running the ball 40 times a game, playing good defense. And that only works when you play these mid-level teams. When you get into the playoffs, or if you play high-powered offenses with good quarterbacks, you can't execute that game plan. You have to scrap it early in the game when you go down 10 or 13 points. And so I just don't think the Steelers have an answer in the passing game with Matt Canada unless he's willing to change something up. And so that brings us to our next point here. What do you expect from Matt Canada in 2023? Do you think you're going to see a different offense than we saw these past 2 years, or is it going to be much of the same?
I personally think it's going to be pretty much identical to what we've seen and what we saw this year. And I think partly that's because he's going to feel, whether it's deserved or not, that because they did a better job in the second half of the year and they executed better, all they need to do is just do that again. Just play the way they did the back half of last year, and they'll be just fine. And I think the issue here is there's going to be natural progression from Kenny Pickett, from some of the receivers in the offense again. The offensive line ostensibly should be better, whether it's because of progression or because they add somebody in the draft or free agency. Whatever the case may be, they should be a better offense from a talent standpoint next year as well. But I don't know how much that matters in an offense like this, because it is fundamentally capped by the way that they run and by the way that they do things. So even if all the players play out of their minds, that's probably a 250-yard passing game and a 150-yard rushing game and 28 points. That's probably the ceiling of this offense. And that's fine against some teams. Like you said, Tommy, you can beat a lot of teams in the NFL that way if your defense is healthy and playing well. We only got half that last year. So again, if you only get a half of that again next year, which again, hopefully not, if you win 10, 11 games with an offense like this, that in the regular season, that's great. But as soon as you have to go on the road to Kansas City, if you have to go on the road to Cincinnati, you're not beating those teams with that offense. You're just not. And it's unfortunate because it really lets down the defense. We have a ton of stars in that. So I think possibly, depending on how you feel about Cam Hayward and how Minka and TJ progress the rest of their careers, possibly 3 Hall of Famers on it right now. And they might not have any significant playoff success while they're here, the way things are going, because if the offense doesn't change fundamentally, they're not going to be able to keep up with teams that, no matter how good your defense is, Kansas City is scoring 24, 27 points. They're going to do that. If you can't do it back, it just doesn't matter at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think I don't even want to say a safe option. It's a very known option, and I think you know what you're getting in Canada. And for whatever reason, whether it's a pride issue or what have you, this team felt comfortable saying, yeah, we'll do this again one more time. Do I expect something different? There's the part of me that looks at this offense and says, okay, yeah, we were missing a lot of talent along the line, in the trenches, but there's a lot of really core pieces on this offense that should make it a good unit. Pat Freiermuth, an ascending tight end. I mean, I think next season, I think you could already consider him a top 10 guy. I think you're looking at a top 5 guy soon because he's just such a secure blanket. George Pickens, I mean, every week I feel like I was sitting there on my couch just like jaw down to the ground because he reeled in some catch that I just didn't expect him to. Even the combination of Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris, I mean, you got 2 backs that you can capably run. And what I did like seeing out of Canada's offense was towards the end of the year, he was getting both of them on the field at the same time. And I think a lot of those packages work pretty successfully. Not something you're going to do every drive, obviously, but something to keep implementing. So from that perspective, I'm like, well, all these weapons are going to be another year further into their career. They're going to have another year to gel with this offense. Kenny Pickett, hopefully, should take steps forward in his second year. This offense should be better, but I don't think it's going to be because of Canada. And I don't think because Canada's around, I think that jump isn't going to be that substantial. Maybe we go from 20 points a game scored on average to 22, 23. I just didn't see anything in his play calling for the most part that was like, oh, wow, he's scheming up this game really well. He's drawing up plays that we need to. It was just consistent, conservative play. And at the end of the day, that's not going to be enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. If the offense is better, it's not going to be by much. And I think because his passing concepts are just so limited, and I've hounded on this so many times this year. If you go back and rewatch the game, watch the all 22, there is just not plays designed to get guys in space. And there's rarely plays designed to go over the middle of the field. Yeah, I think Canada's idea, and this could be, again, a Tomlin and team philosophy thing as well, is let's try to eliminate turnover-worthy plays. And how are we going to do that? We're going to pass the ball outside the hashes where there's not as much traffic in the middle. The problem with doing that is you very much limit yourselves in terms of what you can do after the catch. And it's why Deontay Johnson was 7th in the NFL in targets and 83rd in yards after the catch. Part of it had to do with him running backwards at times. But it's not just a Johnson problem. It is a team concept problem. They need to get these guys in space. If it's so easy to see the difference in scheme and how important it is when you watch a team like Kyle Shanahan in the San Francisco 49ers. And when you get guys in space the way that he does with the yards after the catch, I mean, there's times when there's not 15 yards within George Kittle and a defender because he's so well at doing those bootlegs and protecting well and getting those guys in space. And another thing we got to look at too is, I mean, the Steelers were one of the healthiest offenses in the league this year. They didn't have a single offensive lineman that missed a game, only a handful of snaps at a time for like Mason Cole. And their wide receivers were healthy. Najee played through some injuries. Warren was injured a little bit here and there, but collectively they were the healthiest offense in the league. And so if that doesn't happen again next year, I don't know if we can expect them to even take that minor step forward. Maybe they take a minor step or a big step backwards. And so that's not what you want to see from a team that already scored 18.1 points per game in the 2022 season. I just don't think that Canada was the right choice. I can kind of understand from their perspective why they would do it. He's on a very, very short leash right now. And I think that a lot of the blame has got to fall on Tomlin too. He signed off on this. And so if it doesn't work well in Canada's third season, then there's going to be questions that need to be answered, especially when we look at going back. Randy Fichtner was fired in a year where the Steelers scored 26.6 points per game. And so everybody wants to talk about how bad Randy Fichtner was. Matt Canada has been worse. And just from a statistical perspective. And so the results just need to be better. They've got to be better moving forward. All right. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. All right. We're going to talk now about players who are under contract who the Steelers could cut this year. So this is not including their pending free agents right now, but players who are currently set to play for the 2023 season who maybe shouldn't. And so we're going to kind of go down the list. We'll start with some maybe bigger names, more obvious names, and we'll go right down and we'll share our opinions. And we might match on a lot of these, but I want to see what you think. And the first one to me is it doesn't get any easier than this. If the Steelers make one move this offseason, the easiest one is cutting William Jackson III. And so, Shayne, what do you think?
Yeah, he's about as likely to play for them next year on his current contract, at least as I am. So I feel like realistically, the money just makes no sense for a guy who didn't play for you last year and has been injured. So that's just an immediate cut. But then you do have questions about maybe do you bring him back in camp? Do you want him on the team in some capacity? That's fine if you liked what you saw in him before that made you want to trade for him. But he's not coming back on his current contract. That's pretty much a guarantee. I don't really have to, go too far into that one, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, he's not going to play here for $12 million. That said, I mean, the Steelers traded for him when they really didn't need to way back when. Mike Tomlin was all over him before he got drafted and was settled for Artie Burns instead. There's a connection here. And he's has proven in the past, at least, to be a pretty good man coverage cornerback. He was horrible in zone, and that's why he flamed out with Washington. Mm-hmm. But I think they're going to try to find a way. I think they're going to say, hey, would you be willing to take your salary down to, I don't know, some reasonable number? And I think they're going to try that route before they just outright cut him. Now, if he says, I'll try my luck on the free agency market, again, he's not playing $12 million a season, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him stick around in some capacity, just because I think this is a guy that they liked way back when. This is a guy that, Mike Tomlin wanted. He now has, granted at a very big overpay. I think they're going to find a way to keep him around. But like I said, it's his contract is going to be reduced somehow, whether it's, a reduction beforehand, or if he's not willing to accept a pay cut, then he's just going to be cut outright.
Yeah, William Jackson is a Mike Tomlin guy. We knew that back in the 2016 draft. And I don't care what they say or how they try to cover it up. That was the pick for the Steelers. Like, I think that William Jackson was going to be their guy, and they hit the panic button. They dug down the list for Artie Burns, the next pick. That probably was their backup plan anyway. It was a bad one. I had a third round grade on Burns. I think we all kind of did. And so I think they wanted William Jackson back in 2016. I don't think Tomlin has been able to let it go since then, and that's why he made the trade just before the deadline to get him. It was a low-risk trade in terms of what the Steelers had to get, but you can get out of a $12.1 million contract without a penny in dead money. You are doing it. He is gone. There is also a report that the Steelers don't have interest in bringing him back. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but if they do, he's going to be a 30-year-old corner. I don't think he's had a good season in going back in 2 years now. It's, I think, maybe his first year with Washington. And I just not any incentive to keep him at all. And so maybe they sign him back on the cheap, but he has certainly gone at least once. And I expect that to be probably one of the first moves they make, free up that $12 million instantly. Let's talk about Mitch Trubisky. Started off as the Steelers starting quarterback this year. I think the expectations were a little bit higher than what we saw from Trubisky. And so now, because of the way they structured the contract, the Steelers could save $8 million by getting rid of your backup quarterback. Is that a decision that you do?
I think it has to be, just because, again, you can't, with a team that does need additions across different parts of their team, and they're not going to have, really, no matter what they do, they're not going to have a ton of money to do it. Saving $8 million whenever Trubisky is going to be at best your backup quarterback, as much as he's a good backup to have at this point still, and I think that that's the best role for him moving forward, it can't come at that much money. Like, it's just too much money you can save. You can either find a different backup, you can maybe draft a late round guy. We've seen that work out for some teams recently anyway. Do one of those things, right? Something cheaper as that backup option. So I think it's 100% something you have to do, and then you let him go, figure out what he wants to do next, whether it's a backup or whatever else. So
yeah, there's no good reason to keep Mitch Trubisky around for this upcoming season. I mean, if I had to guess, I don't think he really wants to be here anymore.
I don't think so.
Because, he came in with this idea that he's going to revive his career, and then 3.5 games into it, he gets benched. Even though when he came back, minus the 3 turnovers against the Ravens, he showed a little bit of life again. He showed a little bit of that intrigue that always seems to be around. I'm not going to say it's going to happen for sure, because I don't think his market would be great, but for some reason, teams have seemingly been really interested in him when he signed as a backup with Buffalo and when he hit free agency last year before the Steelers signed him. I think there's a chance he could get flipped for like a very late round pick. I'm talking like swap of late round picks, 7th round pick, to a team that is atop of the draft, says, hey, we're going to try to get a quarterback, but we need plan B, and we need someone to maybe start ahead of time. In the meantime, I could see that happening. If not, I do expect him to be cut. The Steelers don't need to have a Mitch Trubisky type backup quarterback where, okay, he could start if he needs to. But yeah, he doesn't, they don't need that. Pickett's their guy. For better or for worse, he's their guy through next season and probably the season after, at least, to see what he truly has. What you need is a good, solid veteran behind him. I'm talking about like a Case Keenum. I'm talking about like an Andy Dalton, some guy that's coming in and isn't going to have any chance of starting. doesn't have probably really any interest in starting at this point in the career, that can be that nice veteran mentor that's going to, come in, help pick it out in some of the areas that he's struggling with. And then, something were to happen and he needs to come in because of injury, he can hold his own. I see a lot of people say, well, I don't want to spend any more resources on the quarterback. We 2 draft picks last season, all this money on the position. Okay, but you're saving $8 million in cap space. Anyone you sign isn't going to have a cap hit nearly as high as what Trubisky's would be next year. And again, he's a guy that just doesn't want to be here. You're going to be pretty much holding him here against his will. I would, like I said, try to find a late round draft pick if anyone's willing to snag him up on that contract. If that weren't to happen, I would cut him. And like I said, find one of those older guys that have been around the block and can help mentor Pickett and step in if they need to for a couple games.
Yeah, I think Trubisky's gone. I think he should be gone. And I can see the Steelers, I can see them potentially trying to keep him as the backup. I don't think it's a good idea if they do that. I just don't think that he offers that much. And I think we saw that early in the season. He's going to want a shot somewhere else. There's no sense of having any sort of power struggle or anything at this point. Pickett is your guy. They're not going back. Go ahead and get yourself a Brian Hoyer. Get yourself a veteran who has been there a long time, who does not expect to start, just like you said, Andrew. And I think that guy holding the clipboard could help Pickett out more probably than what Trubisky is able to do. And financially, it just doesn't make sense. There's no reason to have an $8 million backup quarterback, especially a guy that he might not play a snap next season if all goes well and Pickett stays healthy. We got to account for displacement here. And so it's not just an $8 million savings. You are saving that much money, but then you have to put some of that back into whoever your number 2 quarterback is going to be. But even let's say if we wanted Mason Rudolph to be that guy, if he was content coming in and saying, I'm going to be a true number 2 from here on out, if he was content doing something like that and you can get him at half the price after the displacement, that'd be worth it. And in fact, maybe you get an upgrade. I'm not sure. I just don't think that the sample that we saw from Trubisky was overwhelmingly good. And I think that there's just, if you look at the free agent list right now, there's like 16 guys. Like there's Mike White and there's Cooper Rush and just a plethora of names that are right, that you would slide Trubisky's name right into those categories. And those guys got pennies last year. A lot of them made under $1 million. And so when you look at it that way, there's just no reason to pay Trubisky this much money to be a backup. Keep that savings, put it towards a good free agent or something else that's going to help bolster your roster and really get you back into contention again, rather than just a quarterback that can come in and play so-so at times for the Steelers. It's not worth it. They can replace that guy. Another name added to this list, and this one's an interesting one. We've got Chukwuma Okoro for Steelers right tackle. Still a young guy, and he just signed with Pittsburgh last year. A lot of people at the time, they kind of cringed a little bit with how much money he was making. Now, the thing is, do the Steelers cut him? Do they keep him? If they cut him, you can save quite a bit of money, or what's your options if not? So, Shayne, what do you think?
I think that because I already am hoping they're going to draft a tackle at some point to either compete with or replace Dan Moore on the left side, trying to replace your other tackle in the same year, I don't see as a good idea. I think Okoro is at least a replacement level tackle, an average tackle, which honestly in the NFL, that could get you pretty far away compared to what some other teams deal with. So because we already have him under contract, we don't have to worry about who can we replace him with. He's the guy that I think is pretty safe. I think maybe next year, if they either just don't think he's going to get any better or they have another opportunity to bring in a different tackle, then you might see it, because I know his deal is for 2 more years. That would make more sense. I think this offseason it's asking a lot to possibly, like I said, be replacing 2 spots to tackle on your offensive line. So
I'm just at the point, I guess, where they've put a lot of band-aids on this offensive line, and I'm ready for it to actually get fixed. And I feel like keeping Chooks at his current price tag isn't fixing anything. I get that Dan Moore has a lot of questions, and I think he's a lot more variable of a player than Chooks is. I think his highs are higher than Chooks, but I think his lows are significantly lower. I also think, honestly, Moore, just based off the skill set he brings, I mean, he's a better run blocker than he is pass protector. I think he could be a logical move to shift over to the right side. Not saying you have to one way or another. I think at the price tag, you have a $4 million roster bonus coming up at the beginning of the year that you can save. After that, it's guaranteed. I think they should cut him. I think they should really look this year to get invested back into the trenches. They have other options that they need to fill, but moving on from him, You still bring in a good tackle. I would probably target a free agent tackle, a couple different ones that make sense. I mean, everyone's going to talk about Orlando Brown, but even beyond him, Mike McGlinchey out with the 49ers. If you could find a way to bring somebody or someone of that caliber in to hold down the right or left side, and then in the draft that keeps you open with that first, 3 picks, in the first 2 rounds of finding another tackle if you want to, finding that guard to compete with Kevin Dotson. I just think at his price tag, I don't think he's worth keeping around. Again, because like you said, Shayne, he's a very average player, but he's getting paid more than what an average tackle would get paid, and this line really needs some actual improvement in it. So I get the idea is, how do we find 2 replacement tackles? I think you find at least one in free agency, and then you have a contingent plan where it's Dan Moore competing with, early pick, maybe some mid-range swing tackle that you pick up in free agency, something along the lines of that, where, he isn't just given the job, but he can compete for it. I just don't think keeping Chuks around at his price tag is worth it though at this point.
Yeah, if the Steelers' tackle depth was a little bit better, I could probably get behind that because I understand what you're saying. And I don't think that Chuks is very good. I don't think that he's a long-term starter. I think that his better play actually came probably earlier in the year, and then he kind of leveled off and his true colors kind of showed again. I think the Steelers need 2 offensive tackles. You need 2 new starters. But getting them, like Shayne said, in the same year is going to be tricky unless you're able to spend big on one and draft one high. It's very unlikely the Steelers will draft 2 tackles high and just start them. Although Seattle just did last year with their tackles, and they did very well. And so it's one of those situations. I certainly want the Steelers to address the offensive tackle position in the draft. I think probably though for now, what would be best is to just have Dan Moore and Chuks battle it out for the right tackle position, and the loser goes back to being a swing tackle. And then you kind of see if you can explore and save that money next year. What's interesting though, it's interesting to note that if the Steelers were to wait and make a core for a post June 1st deadline cut, they would save $10 million with that move, which is a substantial savings. As it stands right now, it'd just be $6.9 million, which is still a good chunk, but they would take a much bigger dead money hit. I wasn't a huge fan of that contract at the beginning with, but offensive tackles, they just get paid. They're worth a lot. And the Steelers seem to be the only team that doesn't value that because they're not investing high in the position. But I don't know if you can afford to do that when you've got like Jesse Davis and Trent Scott behind them. And maybe one of those guys gets re-signed and whatnot. But I do think they need to shore up the tackle depth. I think that would be a little bit too risky of a decision for me right now, but I definitely get what you're saying. I think that within these next 2 years, I'd like to see both of them replaced and both of those positions improved. All right, let's talk about Myles Jack, a player that a lot of people were really talking up last year, very high on him in free agency. Obviously, people knew Myles Jack well back from the 2016 NFL draft. Many of them wanted the Steelers to draft Myles Jack instead of Artie Burns, which would have proven to be a better choice. I did not think he played particularly well this year. And again, almost identical to Trubisky's, the way that Trubisky's contract was structured. The Steelers could save $8 million by cutting Myles Jack. Is that a decision that you make this offseason?
Yeah, it's just at this point, the money is the issue, right? Like if you were to bring Jack back as a Band-Aid type of guy at linebacker, if you strike out with Edmonds or some other guys that might be a better fit, then that's fine if you want to bring him back for less money, but you can't retain him at his current salary. It doesn't make sense to do that. He wasn't an $8 million a year player last year. I don't think he will be this year coming up either. They're going to probably just sign multiple guys that either already was on this team last year or that are going to be kind of bargain bin guys. It's my most likely solution that they're probably going to do. Maybe they also, I'm hoping they draft somebody in like mid rounds because that's where you get a lot of value at linebacker nowadays, but it's probably not going to be in their plans to keep him at his current salary, and it shouldn't be.
This was one I was really torn on for a long time because when he was signed last year, I'm like, people are going to overrate this move, and everyone instinctively did. We got Myles Jack. He was this great player for Jacksonville. And yeah, he looked great early on in his career when that Jacksonville defense had just a ferocious front seven that, allowed him to kind of just play a lot more free. And then they lost a lot of that talent, and that talent got older and left, and their defense regressed, and he regressed right along with it. So when that contract came out, I wasn't really expecting a whole lot because he was going to a team that was a better position than where he was with Jacksonville, but this defense still had some work to do, especially along their defensive line. going through this entire season, I'm like, okay, his play hasn't been great. Probably hasn't been worth the money. But we have no one at off-ball linebacker. I mean, the only person under contract for this upcoming season right now is Mark Robinson, which I hope as much as I can that the 7th round pick is going to work out and he can carve out a role on defense. You don't have enough snaps to be able to sit here and say, yeah, pencil him into one of those spots, because that's way too much of a risk. So up until like maybe the last couple weeks of the year, I'm like, Jack's going to stick around. It's going to be at a price tag that's too much, but they're going to want another familiar face in while they look for some longer term solutions. What really broke that idea, though, is the last couple of games when both Jack and Devin Bush were replaced for Robert Spillane and Mark Robinson. You know, just seeing him get benched like that, I think it's really hard to justify saying we're going to pay this guy $8 million this upcoming season when he couldn't beat out Robert Spillane and Mark Robinson at the very end of the year. But I think this opens up a huge hole then at off-ball linebacker again, where you're sitting here saying we don't have anyone we can count on starting. And I do find it kind of interesting, Shayne, that you're talking about, you know, him not being worth the money. And I'll tie it to like just what I said with Chooks. I don't think he's worth the money, and I think you could have a better contingent plan on moving someone there. And as opposed to, I think you have less depth I think off-ball linebacker has the least depth of any position on the roster right now, because there is literally no one outside of Mark Robinson. I think it's going to be a hard cut. There's a part of me that really, even still now, is sitting here saying, oh, they're going to keep him for one more year. He'll try to, you know, revive himself with this defense. I just think seeing him get benched, it's really hard to justify keeping him around. So I don't expect to see it happen. That said, of all the names we've said so far, I think he's the most likely to maybe stick around.
Yeah, I agree with what you said there, Andrew. I mean, the linebacker depth is horrendous right now. Robert Spillane's a free agent. Devin Bush is a free agent. Bush is not coming back. I think that's pretty clear. He played 5 snaps in each of the last 2 games. But I think what you were saying is the fact that we can't tell the difference in terms of one player better than the other between Spillane, Bush, Jack, and even Robinson, who finally got on the field late in the season. I think that shows you exactly why you need to save that money. He's not worth bringing back at that price. He played fewer snaps down the stretch. And so, even though he ended up with quite a few snaps by the end of the season, it was genuinely a 3-way split between him, Spillane, and Bush. And they preferred Spillane as the coverage guy, which tells you something about Jack's coverage ability. It's not very good. And if we're looking at, I mean, I know a lot of people don't have respect for like PFF grades. This is 2 straight years that Myles Jack has graded out worse than Devin Bush. And we all know what we think about Devin Bush. And so take that with what you will, but I don't think that Jack's been playing well. I don't think that he's a coverage linebacker. I think that he's serviceable in that buck role where you come downhill. Outside of that, he's kind of a liability. And then got to remember as well, linebackers, they don't last very long in the NFL, and not like they used to in the past. They're kind of like the running backs of the defense right now. If you get a guy up at age 28, 29, 30 years old, then you're doing pretty good for yourself. Jack is already there. And if you remember, this is a guy that had a degenerative knee issue coming out of school, which is why he fell to the 2nd round in the first place. And so I think there's too many factors going on here. I don't care how bad the depth is on the team. I think the Steelers had the worst off-ball linebackers in the NFL this past season, because if you can go through all 31 other teams, and it's really hard to make a case that any other team had worse off-ball linebackers than what Pittsburgh did. It was that bad. And so I think if you shore up that position, if you save that $8 million and throw it into a TJ Edwards, you throw it into somebody else who can make more of an impact for your team, I think that would be a better use of your money. I just don't see any incentive, despite the name, his former draft status, whatever else. I don't see enough incentive to bring him back with an $8 million price tag when the displacement, you can save at least $5 million of that and put that back into a different player, or you've got draft capital this year. I think the sweet spot is draft those guys in the 2nd and 3rd round. I think it's been working out for a lot of teams around the league. I think the Steelers need to get younger and fresher and faster at the linebacker position, and they need guys that can cover. They don't have one of those guys on their roster right now, and it irks me so bad. And so because of that, they'd be better off going to just a heavy safety package when they go into nickel and dime, because they don't have linebackers that can cover. That's what they need. If it's up to me, Jack is gone. All right, let's talk about Ahkello Witherspoon real quickly here. Witherspoon he's got a decent contract, but the Steelers could save $4 million if they cut him this offseason. Very injured this past year. It had that hamstring injury, was way more severe than what we thought it was going to be in the season prior to that. I thought he had a really good 6-game stretch to close out the 2021 season. This year did not look so good in the time that he did play. What do you do with him?
I think this one is really because the money isn't very big and you can't save a ton by cutting him. It's likely he comes back and they try to see if he can, if he's healthy, recapture that form he had the back half of last year. I wouldn't be that surprised if they cut him just again because he didn't really play much for them at all last year. I think they are going to try to revamp this corner room through the draft and also maybe a little bit through free agency, especially if they can bring Sutton back. But it does feel like one of those deals where you have a guy who is high variance anyway, and he just had injury issues last year, not making a ton of money. Unless they really need to kind of shore up the edges of the cap and like need to make a little bit of space to do one thing here or there, I'm pretty confident he'll probably stick around just as maybe a boundary corner, depending on who they bring in. Maybe he gets another chance to start, and then maybe Sutton goes back in the slot, whatever it may be. But I'll be surprised if he's not on the team at all.
I'll go the exact opposite way. I don't see any reason why he sticks around. I get that he had and I was really excited to see him get brought back last offseason because I'm like, okay, this guy showed a lot towards the end of the season. It took him a while to get on the field. It was kind of a weird trade just to begin with, waiting that long to get him. But once he got on the field, I was like, okay, this is kind of weird to see the Steelers have this coverage cornerback for once. And then we come into this year, he gets that new deal, identical deal to what Levi Wallace got in free agency. And he never showed up. I mean, he was kind of given those reins at the beginning. Levi Wallace was the third cornerback. Okello didn't look good. He looked like he was back at his lows, and that was something that had been a pretty constant thing with him throughout the years, where he's a very feast or famine player. I think at this point, what he is at his age. He's not going to get much better than what he's at. Will he have a couple of really good games from time to time? Sure. And I think on a team where, he could maybe be that third or fourth cornerback to come in and, rotate in, fine. But I would rather have Levi Wallace, James Pierre, and Cameron Sutton be the trio with some day 2 or early day 3 rookie behind them developing than bringing him back and just acting like the cornerback room is solved. I don't really see a path for him. His play even before the injury wasn't that strong. I mean, he was getting cooked against the Patriots. I mean, the only highlight that he had really was that interception with the Bengals. I think once James Pierre got on the field, you saw better overall cornerback play. And Pierre, while I have a bit of a soft spot for him because, I like his underdog story of how he got to the Steelers, he's not anything special as a cornerback. He's a good low-end 2-3 type player. But he came in, I think he outplayed him. I don't really see a sense. And I'd save the $4 million and put it towards a different depth player somewhere else. I don't think there's any real need to keep Witherspoon on the roster.
Yeah, I think the Steelers, we would all probably agree that they have one legitimate corner on the roster. That's Cameron Sutton, who is a free agent this year. I fully expect the Steelers to sign him back because it's just what they do. Now, with that savings, though, $4 million, it's kind of substantial. And so if you are already going into free agency with the mindset that I'm going to go out and pay for one more corner anyway, then you probably should save that money. And I think it's a very high possibility that the Steelers could draft a corner with one of their first 3 or 4 picks. And so you got to do the math right now and map it out. Is he going to be around anyway? Is he a guy we're going to cut down the line? If you're going to cut him anyway, it's the savings difference is any different for him if he's a pre-June or first or a post-June first. And so they might as well get that money to spend at the beginning of free agency if that's the way they want to go. I'm kind of split on him because I've seen really good play from Witherspoon. I've seen really awful play from him. And so I think that what you're probably going to end up getting is going to be too high variance for you to trust in your secondary anyway. And I think you're going to be able to get better options than him moving forward. It just depends on, do you want him there for depth purposes? If somebody goes down with an injury, can he come in nickel and come in dime and be a boundary cornerback for them? Which I think that he can do in some regard. It's just that I think Witherspoon is what he is at this point in his career. I think he's 27, maybe going into age 28 season. So he's not getting any younger, fresher. He's just that guy. And so I wouldn't be opposed to them trying to save that $4 million, invest that back into another player, maybe in free agency. Montravius Adams, a guy who I think kind of struggled this year for the Steelers. He looked good when they signed him last year. He kind of bounced around the league for a little bit, just in a pinch, was good for them down the stretch. But this year, I think the combination of him and Tyson Alulo at nose tackle, it made for kind of a disastrous pairing, and neither one of them were stout enough to hold up at the point of attack there. The Steelers would save Let's see. I'll find it here in a second. I'll go to you, Shayne. They would save a few million with this decision here if they were to cut Montravius Adams. Would you do that?
Yeah, I think that other than offensive line and then out of necessity linebacker, where they're going to have to invest a lot into those positions just by default, this might be the where they spend most of their time getting new bodies in here. This defensive line was just not very good outside of Cam Hayward, and Ogunjobi was fine, but again, I don't even know if he'll be back. I think this is a guy that, because he does have some amount of money on his contract, he's not like a rookie on a rookie deal at this point. He is a guy I think you do cut because you do plan to invest a lot in this position, whether it's other rookies, later round draft picks, maybe even a higher draft pick than maybe people were thinking, depending on who falls on the board there. But he's just a guy that, because he's making, like I said, any amount of money, and they're already going to probably move on from him as far as his place in the rotation. He barely made the team last year. Feels like a pretty easy decision.
He's a curious one because, again, his contract isn't huge. I mean, you're looking at, I think, just under a $3 million cap hit. You save most of that by releasing him. Alulu's, I would almost guarantee he's going to retire. If for some reason he doesn't, he's certainly not going to be back with the Steelers. You got no one at nose tackle right now. And while, Adams doesn't give you a whole lot, he's at least a familiar face on a very cheap deal. I think at the bare minimum, this is a guy that's going to get held at least through the draft. And we've seen them do this with other players. I mean, Mark Barron comes to mind a couple of years ago, where it's a player that they don't necessarily want on the team, but they want that insurance policy. Are the Steelers really going to go into free agency and spend big money on, a big run-stopping nose tackle? They might. I just don't know if that's going to be in the cards for them. They may be looking for more like another defensive end type, some more pass rush help in the middle, and same thing in the draft. I think what's going to ultimately happen is they're going to bring another lower name guy in free agency. There's no one that rings a bell, but I'm sure if you go through, there's a couple different, typical run pluggers. You're going to sign him on the cheap. I'd look in that third, fourth round to maybe invest a draft pick in a typical nose tackle, some big run stuffer up in the middle. And then you carry all three to camp and you say, all right, whoever's going to start is going to start. If Adam, for some reason, really shows up and does well, then you have a cheap starter. If he gets beaten out, he's easily cuttable later on. There's no roster bonus that's going to get guaranteed with him. I don't think he's a player that you have to keep around. I just think at his price, and given the fact that you're going to want at least a familiar face there as insurance, and I could even see it as early as after the draft. If they're comfortable with their room after the draft, that could be a very obvious time where you see Adams gets cut. But if not, I think there's a good chance he gets carried to camp, and they were kind of just going to throw it up in the air and let the cards fall as they may.
Yeah, yet again, another position with bad depth on the Steelers. Go figure. There's quite a few of those, it seems. I think that I would get rid of Adams personally. I think that the Steelers will keep them. If I were to make my prediction right now for what they would do, and it's because I think Alulu is gone. He's either going to retire or they're not going to re-sign him back. He did not play very well at all for them, and he ended up getting demoted for Adams. It's frustrating, though, because I feel like the Steelers already had this player. They had Isaiah Buggs, and then Buggs goes to the Lions, and he has a really good year this year. I think that Buggs right now is way more stout in terms of his run defense, and I think he offers a little bit of a spark as a pass rusher, too. And so it's kind of frustrating to have that guy, to cut him and then end up getting worse play out of the guys that you ended up keeping on your roster. Adams is a guy who's going to be in his late 20s. You can save $2.5 million with his release. I would probably, personally, I would like to throw that back into a true nose tackle that can play that position for the Steelers. And I think they also need to draft one pretty desperately because they just don't have a guy that can fill that role for them. It's not a position that they need to use often. Like I'd rather have like the long 5 technique guy. They still need to find like Stephon Tuitt's long-term replacement. But I do think they need another body there. And so it won't surprise me if Adams is the guy that they choose for that. But I also think that he probably shouldn't be there next year based off of how he played. All right, we're just going to do one more name. We're running out of time here on this show. Gunnar Olszewski. What do we make of him? I mean, he's a guy that got demoted from being the return man early on. He did do well when he came in on offense on like the jet sweep plays and in terms of blocking. But is that good enough for him to stick around in the 2023 season?
Yeah, I just don't see any point. I mean, his value was as a returner primarily. He wasn't able to do that for us, and that's kind of where it ends for me. I mean, he was the designated, him and for some reason I can't think of his name right now, were the guys that came in and just where they are the run package receivers. It's the only time they're on
Miles
the field.
Boykin.
Yeah, exactly. Boykin. Yeah. Those, when they were on the field, we were either running a jet sweep with him or we were running the ball. Like, that's just what he did. You could find somebody to do whatever that weird package is that Canada likes. Just doesn't make sense to keep him around. And I don't think he's an offensive player truly, at least not an actual receiver. And at least early they never gave him a chance to be one. So if they don't think he can be, you might as well get rid of him.
Yeah, I'll give him credit because Gunner looks like he's about my size, which isn't very big, but he is willing to throw his nose into it on.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Take on bigger guys, and credit to him because I'd be scared, you know what, if I was in his role there. That said, he was brought in primarily as a special teamer. They wanted him to be their return guy. He can also play in the other phases of special teams. He lost the returner job to Steven Sims. Did a very mediocre job even before he fumbled away his job, literally. And his role on offense, like you said, it's, the occasional jet sweep, but he didn't even do that well with the ball in his hands as a returner, as an offensive weapon. There's no reason to keep him around. If you really want to have that designated return guy, bring back Steven Sims on a shorter contract. I think he showed a little bit more juice, and I think he offers you more on offense. Sure, he won't play coverage units like Gunner would. He's not going to have that tiny man mentality when he needs to go throw a block, but there's no reason to keep Gunner on this roster. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to predict that he sticks around at least for the summer, and then the Steelers are going to kind of play it by ear from there. They value special teams in the ability that they can get out of him just as a coverage unit guy. But I do think when you look at the roster, you got Calvin Austin coming back next year. He's guaranteed to make a roster spot, 4th round pick. They're going to want to see what they have in their receiver that runs a 4.3. And then it's very likely that I think the Steelers probably go out and draft a receiver at some point this year. And they just signed Anthony Miller back to a futures contract who can do the return stuff as well, which that might end up being Steven Sims' replacement. But I think that if you looked at the collection of those things, with Anthony Miller and Calvin Austin and the draft pick, I just don't think there's going to be any room for them. I think he ultimately gets cut, but I don't think it's going to happen until maybe just before the season. All right, we're going to stop there for now. Andrew, I want to ask you one question. I'm going to put you on the spot here right before we sign off for today. Can you give us your Super Bowl prediction? Shayne and I did this last week. What 2 teams do you have matching up, and who's going to win?
So my wife is very irrationally, she's a Bengals fan. So I know. Trust me, her father-in-law's Cleveland. Her mom's a Dallas Cowboys fan. It's for some reason she decided to latch herself to the Bengals recently and the Dolphins.
Okay. Well.
That said, we're all sitting and watching, and the Chiefs are the Chiefs. They're a great team, but Joe Burrow, man, he's something else. He just works well in that offense. The receivers work well. I think the Bengals are heading back to the Super Bowl. I think they're going to upset the Chiefs. On the flip side, I really think it's Philadelphia. I get that, the Brock Purdy train is there and everyone's all excited, but he is what he is. I think you saw a lot of limitations with him against Dallas, which granted Dallas has a really good defense, but the 49ers have a pretty potent one as well. I just think that offense that Philadelphia has is going to outmatch the 49ers. So I think those two are going to go from there. I do think Philadelphia would end up winning it. I just think they're the better team overall, and maybe that's just me not wanting to go all in on the Bengals. But I would honestly, I think it would be a very entertaining game if it's Philadelphia and Cincinnati in the Super Bowl. So
I think that it would be as well. So there you have it, right from Andrew. Thank you for following us. Thank you for joining us today, Andrew, and thank you for those who watched. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow Andrew on Twitter at False Andrew. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can check out the Steel Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast, and also check us out on YouTube. Thanks for listening to the Steel Curtain podcast.